Welcome, everyone. I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. This is just a reminder that today's presentation will be recorded and posted on the Whitburn Center's website and YouTube channel. We ask that you please keep your mics on mute. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. My name is Lisa Lewis, and I'm the Administrative Manager in the Whitburn Center for Governance and Policy Research. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about the Whitburn Center. The Whitburn Center was established in the fall of 2021 through a generous donation from our founding benefactor, UWO alumni Jerry Whitburn. Our mission is to conduct nonpartisan, practical, applied research focused on elevating and improving governance, professional management, and public policy in Wisconsin and beyond. Our vision is to build local government, nonprofit, and community capacity to promote the common good. To do this work, it requires bringing people together in spaces like this one to work together to share knowledge and equip public professionals with tools and resources to better understand the dynamic topic areas surrounding Wisconsin's public sector. And with that said, Michael Ford, our director, will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you everybody for coming here. And as I put in the chat, welcome. So Gabe Loyakino, aside from being a very good basketball player, as I've learned, is a professor of history at UW Oshkosh. He has written a book entitled Hog Reeves Are Part of the State Too, Local Governance in the Early Republic, and How Welfare Worked in the Early United States, 5 Microhistories. Currently, he's studying taxation in early Oshkosh and comparing local government in the USA and England, circa 1800. His presentation today is titled, What Was Local Government Like 200 Years Ago? So very excited to learn a little bit about the history of local government and happy to turn it over to Dr. Loyakino.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Mike. And thanks to all of you for joining me over your noon hour. It's a busy time for all of us, especially those of us in the last week of the semester here at UWO. So thank you for being here. I also want to thank the Whitburn Center in general, the Tommy Thompson Center, which sponsored some of this research, and the Faculty Development Fund at UW Oshkosh, which also sponsored some of this research. I'm going to be a bit interactive. I welcome you to ask questions at any point in the chat or over your speaker. And I have a lot of pictures, and I'm occasionally will ask you what you think of them or what we can learn from something. I hope you all can see the slides pretty well. I'm going to skip ahead and just say what I want to talk about. 3 things that I hope to finish well before our hour is up, to take time for questions at the end. But as I said, I'm happy to have questions at any time. But first, I want to talk a little bit about why I'm curious about local government 200 years ago and why I think you might be. Number 2, I want to talk a little bit about how England shapes America's history of local government and what the connections are there and what more we need to know. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about what I've learned on the subject of taxing and spending in early Oshkosh. Like Mike said, I'm beginning projects on both English local government in America and early Oshkosh. And in this talk, you'll see that both projects are in early stages, and I'm trying to bring them together here. So this is exciting for me to have a chance to talk to you, those of you who are in public administration in particular. I'm curious what you want to know about the history of local government. So please let me know somewhere along the way. All right, so let's get started. Why am I interested in this? As Mike mentioned, I wrote a book about poor relief, or welfare as we call it today. And I found that it was a really big job of local government at the time that the American Revolution happened, before, during, and after the Revolution. It was the most expensive thing that Americans paid for in their tax, the taxes that they paid, mostly property taxes. And it was just a part, it turns out, of a really vigorous local government. And I wrote a recent article with hog reeves in the title, and you can see a picture of a hog reeve here. And the point of this article was that in American history, we tend to focus a lot on the founding, which is appropriate, and the new national government. We focus a little bit less on the new state governments. Most of them are new during and after the revolution. We don't talk much at all about local government. And I would argue that local government is still, in that era, the most powerful of governments that people encounter. And I think I have an example here of why or how local government is powerful. I'll show you both in terms of dollars and in terms of people. So what you should see here is a newspaper article detailing who won election to local office in a town that I'm really familiar with, Providence, Rhode Island, in 1800. In Providence, these local offices were elected every year, every summer in their case. And I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to a list that I compiled of what offices they elected. And so you can see them here. And here's where I'm curious for your feedback. Are there any of these offices that you want to know more about? I don't know what all of them do. But what do you take away from all of the things, all of the offices elected in 1800? And these were elected before the Revolution, during the Revolution, and after. You've got the town clerk, packers of beef, overseers of the hospital, fence viewers, inspectors of lime, sealers of leather, scavengers. What do you take from this list? There are a lot, absolutely.
I'll ask you a question, Gabe, if
Yeah.
if nobody else wants to. That's a good question. Charlie asked in the chat if they were all compensated, but
Yeah.
and maybe this is the public administration professor in me, but I see this and I'm thinking, okay, we have inspectors here. We have people that are working on regulating activities in the community, business activities, that if they're all elected positions, this seems like it's ripe for corruption and people running with axes to grind.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so is the one about compensation. And Chris makes a really good point that they're doing things that are now, if I'm understanding you, Chris, now done by state government. And that's absolutely true. I think the colonies and then the states empowered local officials to do most of the actual governing and gave them a great deal of power. How are they compensated? Mostly by fees. It's not until the 1830s that some of these positions start to be salaried. And there is some pretty good work on how that changes over time. Elizabeth, you're right. I think this does change in the progressive era when a lot of these local government positions become professionalized. It even starts to change in the middle of the 19th century. The position that I'm most familiar with, the overseer of the poor, is kind of someone who learns on the job in this period, 1800, and becomes someone who's much more professional and trained and salaried by the mid-19th century. What does the town crier do? Literally goes around town announcing things, crying things, so letting people know that there's going to be a meeting, or in the case of emergencies, letting people know about that. I think they are all compensated on a case-by-case fee basis, and I think you're right, that does open them up to corruption. I think countering that, they are elected by every free man, so basically every propertied man in the case of Rhode Island who has been accepted by the town meeting. So there is an annual election so that people who are angry about how things are going have a chance to make a fuss and go to the town meeting and lobby against the re-election of somebody. But absolutely, you can have an axe to grind. You could inspect some people's potash more closely than you inspect others. I think that all can happen. Did they have the same roles year after year? There is a lot of continuity. Generally speaking, the same people will inhabit a role for a few years, and then if they're ambitious in terms of town office, they might go to a more important and better compensated role over time. The overseer of the poor that I know best is first elected in 1792, when there are 3 overseers of the poor who are also the assessors. And he winds up staying in that office. He's reelected every year except for 1 year for 36 years. That's unusually long, but that can happen. Josh points out that very few are dedicated to health and disease. That is true. There often are ad hoc committees to get rid of, say, rotting meat around the butchers, and they consider that very much the public health problem. Lots of really good points. Elizabeth says the other lesson to be learned is that they're adaptable to the needs of the citizenry. They really are quite adaptable. How large is a town? That's a great question. And I think Providence in 1800 is several thousand people, if I remember correctly, but I can't put my finger on the exact population, but they can really vary in size. This is for a larger town, circa 1800, this list of officials. And Anne is right. I think what you've seen in your genealogical research is really true, that people will take turns, especially in the smaller towns. Many of these jobs are jobs no one wants. They're all, for the most part, part-time jobs that you do on top of your main gig, which is usually farming in the smaller towns. And so they do trade these jobs back and forth. In both England and the United States, it does happen that people are elected to a position and then don't want to serve because it's such a pain and it doesn't get you much. And so they will actually pay fines instead of serving. That's fair, Evan. Really, really good point. Did the want for control of specific positions lead to privatization and less government control? That's a great question, Brooke. And we're looking here at a New England town, so the Northeast, and that's a little bit different, as I'll point out in a second, from other places in the country. Well, I'm going to skip ahead here and come back, but I do want to point out that there is regional variation in the United States. The New England states tend to have really powerful town governments that do a lot of market regulation and a lot of banishing of people. Both in the Mid-Atlantic and the South, counties become more important. The South did rely on parishes, as England did, until shortly after the Revolution, and then in different states, parish government starts to be replaced by county government. So they can vary by region. Really, really good points. The only other thing I would add here is that this is a very highly regulated place. Most government that you experience is going to happen at the local level, and they're really going to get into your business. They have the power to banish people. They have the power to separate families. They have the power to tell you what you can do with your property. They have the power to say your beer is not good enough to sell in our market. So there's a great deal of power. And hog reeves are just one of those officials. I like to focus on that one because it's open. There's some comic gold in there. But basically a hog reeve's job was to make sure that all hogs in town are not getting in trouble and that they are all ringed in the nose and yoked so that they can be kind of grabbed by people. This could be a serious job. Hogs could cause a great deal of trouble and could be dangerous to other creatures, even to children in towns and cities. But by 1800, the job hog reeve wasn't elected as much anymore. The job of a hog reeve was often done by a field driver, and where hog reeves were elected, it was often a joke. And if you want to read more about their hog reeve jokes, I did write a short article called "Let's give hog reeves their due." But I want to move on quickly to point out what this means for taxes. Local government taxes are by far the biggest taxes that oh, there is a hog reeve story, Mike points out in the chat. I'll have to look into that later. But local taxes are by far the biggest tax burden of Americans in this period. The national government almost never taxes people directly, with a few exceptions, including in 1799. And states tax, but it's a fraction of the amount that towns tax. So towns do most of the taxing, or I should say municipalities, counties and towns. And as you can see in this budget from Providence, in that the same year they elected all those officers, by far the overseers of the poor spend the largest part of the budget. And that's pretty typical for most American locales right through the 1830s, when schools and roads start to catch up. So people are paying most of their tax money to local government, which is spending most of that on poor relief, or what we would call welfare in this period. Here, just for fun, because I know this history well, are a couple of examples of how that's spent. So here, the overseer of the poor is asking the town treasurer to pay to Sal Thomas $3 for her taking care of Ginny Whipple in Ginny Whipple's last sickness. And so that is pretty typical of how that money gets spent. Often the overseer will pay ordinary people to do some of the work the government is required by law to do, which includes taking care of people in need. One thing that you in public administration today might be especially interested to know is that the overseer of the poor, as an elected public official, could do business with himself as a private merchant. And so the town of Providence in this receipt is paying William Larned for linen, thread, cotton, etc., on behalf of people who need it. So people in need. So basically, Larned, as overseer of the poor, is buying from Larned as a merchant. So that can happen too. Yeah, well, let me pause here and ask if there are any questions about this early American local government before we talk about connections to England and what those connections are. That's a quick picture of a very powerful local government that spends most tax money and is governed by annually elected officials, for the most part, who are doing this as a part-time job, though some of the bigger offices, like overseer of the poor, become full-time. And these were one-year terms. So that was considered very democratic in the sense that you were close to the voters. If they didn't like what you were doing, they could vote you out in 1 year. And Andy asks, how did elections work? The town crier goes throughout the town, announces that there's going to be an election in a town meeting. And if you were qualified, which basically means that you owned property and were an adult man, then you could just show up to the town meeting and vote in person. The town meetings had a reputation of not being well attended. So only when there was controversy would a lot of people go to town meeting. Otherwise, it was just the people who showed up. And were the elections perceived as fair is a great question. The evidence only says no occasionally. And yeah, John Muraski, you're right. There aren't that many attendees in 1800 either. They're usually thought of as very fair. This overseer of the poor that I know of, William Larned, I discovered that some people thought he had a lock on the job, and that if you wanted business with the overseer of the poor, you better support him and the Federalist Party. He was a Federalist, and so that can happen. But I think the fact that attendance was low, Andy, suggests that at least of qualified voters, they generally thought things were going okay. Great questions. Chris asks, did towns work together or operate independently? Great question. They theoretically operate independently, but sometimes they will cooperate with each other and try to coordinate their efforts. Sometimes, though, they're totally at cross purposes. They all have the power to banish people who aren't legally entitled to poor relief in that town. And theoretically, everyone's entitled to poor relief in some town. And so they will often take each other to court over whose responsibility it is to pay for someone in need. So I would say, in my period, they're more often in conflict, at least in the records, than they are in concert. Great question. So I want to say a little bit about the role of England, and this has been the subject of my sabbatical research this semester. I got to go to England last month, and the first place I went was the UK National Archives and just ordered some stuff that looked interesting, and these documents were what came back. And so here I'm going to ask you, what do we know about George III? These are all memorials to King George III, who's famous in America. What do we know about this guy? I guess the obvious is that he's king at the time of the American Revolution, has an important role in Hamilton, an American musical, for those of you who have seen that musical. And you have probably heard of his struggle with mental illness, as Evan says. Yeah, he doesn't actually abdicate, but he does have a regent in charge for most of his later reign. And absolutely, Christina, the American Revolution is what he's most famous for. And so it was interesting for me to go to the UK archives and see him in a totally different light. As you can see here, this is a memorial to the King's Most Excellent Majesty from the people of Wigtown. Wigtown is in Scotland. Most of these examples are from England. But what really interested me is that is who was writing to the king and why. So it's 1789. The U.S. is just organizing our government under the new Constitution. But what's happening in England and capturing national attention is that the king is recovering from his first bout of serious illness. And now, in retrospect, we see this as the first of what's going to become more bouts with mental illness. But for people at the time, it's unclear to me how much they know about why he's ill, but it's big news that he's recovered in the spring of 1789. And so these are basically all congratulatory messages to the king. But what particularly interested me, and I think might interest many of you in public administration, is who's writing. So here are just a few examples. From Wigtown, we have the magistrates, more or less the justices of the peace, and town council of the royal borough of Wigtown in common council assembled. From Stockbridge, we have the bailiff, burgesses, and inhabitants of the town and borough of Stockbridge. From Stamford, we have the mayor, recorder, aldermen, and capital burgesses of the borough. Does anyone, what strikes you about these names and these titles? Are any of you a mayor, recorder, alderman, burgess, town council? You work with these people. I'm not sure what, village trustee. Okay, and Mike says we do, yes. Yeah, so obviously a lot of the names that we use for officials in local government in America exist in England in the 1780s, and in fact are much, much older than that. They go back really far. And so what I was curious about this fall is how much connection is there between English local government and American local government? American local government uses a lot of the same terms. It's British American local government that really kind of sets up, I think, the local government that we have today. And so there's clearly a lot of important British antecedents, precedents for the way we do things today. But as I discovered in my trip, and as I tried to portray in this slide, English local government around 1800 is incredibly complicated. I mean, I kept using the word ridiculous to describe this. There's so much going on, so many different types of local government, overlapping jurisdictions. In one place, one kind of local government will do the job of, say, poor relief. Often it's the parish. But in other places, it might be the incorporation or the borough officials. In other places, it might be the justices of the peace. And the same goes for a lot of the different jobs of local government. And you can see here that they have both royally chartered or incorporated boroughs that are often called the corporation. And they also still have manors with a lord that have their own separate type of local government. And yeah, Alex, you're right. Once you visit, you see that many of these institutions still go. If you're in London, you start to see how they still keep track of the older different jurisdictions, the parishes, the cities, the boroughs, and then parishes are really important. So parishes are a unit of church governance, but they also do much of the poor relief and a lot of the street lighting in this period. And just to make matters more complicated, who governs what place, as I tried to portray here, becomes quite complex. So there are manors like Withycombe Raleigh over here and Withycombe Norton here that might overlap with parishes like the parish of Withycombe or the parish of Littleham. All of these are in a place that today is called Exmouth, and people called it Exmouth then too, but there was no Exmouth government per se. There were these overlapping parishes and manors. In addition to that, the corporation of the city of Exeter up the River Exe here claimed jurisdiction over the river itself. So things got really complicated. And so part of my job from here on out is to try to figure out how we can draw lines from English local government of the 17th century all the way to the present. So I hope that you can see that I'm early here in this research, but I want to just point out that there are a lot of connections, that essentially the United States uses British institutions before, during, and after the Revolution, and we're still using them now. But Chris, thank you. It is confusing. So keep your eyes on this spot, and I will have something more to say in the future. I do want to point out that English people were complaining all the time about these local governments. Many of you are probably familiar with Daniel Defoe, famous for writing Robinson Crusoe. What he's writing here is a pamphlet against parish government. He doesn't like the taxes, and the powers that parishes have. And you make a good point in the chat. Local government jurisdiction sure does overlap today, right? I'm sure it causes some of the same headaches. So people are, I don't know if this makes you feel better, but people are complaining about that in the 18th century. And England does have a major reform in the 1830s. The UK does a lot of reformation of different kinds of things. And one of the things that they do is they reform local government, in particular, the old royally chartered boroughs. Still, there's a lot of complication in the English history of local government. But as I mentioned, that's what gives us the local government that we have today. Both towns, which are popular in New England, which are modeled often on what are called the godly towns of Eastern England in the 17th century. We also have counties, which become, I think, more significant in British America and the United States than they are in England. There are still Dutch manors left over in New York State in the early USA. And then, as I mentioned, Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas do a lot with parish government in the colonial era. And then there's a big kind of argument about whether Church of England parishes should still be the unit of local government. And in the early 19th century, counties take a lot of that power. All right, I'm going to move in a minute to Oshkosh, but I'm wondering if there are any questions or points that people want to make. I think you've made a lot of good points. We still have some of the same problems today that English local government had in the 18th and 19th centuries, but we're still using a lot of the institutions that began in medieval or early modern England. Other questions or thoughts? All right, well, I want to move here to the history of Oshkosh, and so I'm taking a leap. First, let me make a point that the kind of government that I'm talking about is the kind that begins in the 1830s and 40s, and that's brought by U.S. Americans from the East Coast to Wisconsin. Certainly there is local government, Ho-Chunk local government and Menominee local government here in the place where I am sitting in the 1830s. And that's something that I want to know a lot more about. And so we'll get to that in a minute. And there's also charity happening on the part of indigenous people towards those Americans coming to Wisconsin in the 1830s and 40s. So William Wright, for example, is a prolific writer about his experience as a teenager coming to Oshkosh in the 1830s. And he notes that along the way, Stockbridge people put him and his dad up and feed them. And he's a very devout Methodist, and he tells a story about a traveling Methodist preacher who gets lost between Fond du Lac and Oshkosh, is settling down for the night, and a man that he describes only as, quote, a friendly Indian comes along, makes a fire, stays together with them, and then kind of sees him off on his way. So there's lots of charity happening already, and I want to know more about that, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the imported government, the sort of English / US government that's brought to Wisconsin in the 1830s and 40s. Dave asks a great question in the chat, going back to the American Revolution. Do I think the push for less or limited government during the Enlightenment was related to the proliferation of local governments? That's a great question. I don't think I can answer for Europe. I do think that in the USA, local governments make the American Revolution possible. So I think all of the local governing that's happening in 1775 just keeps going, keeps chugging right through the revolution. And national or imperial government gets blown up in the revolution. Most colonial governments also get seriously changed or replaced during the revolution. Most local government just keeps doing what it's doing, often with the same people in charge. And so I think one of the unsung factors of the American Revolution, what made it successful, is that local government kept working. It was the government that already governed people most, and it kept things more stable than they otherwise would be. So I think you're right, Mike. I think it is a good example and one that we should talk about more. All right, so getting to Oshkosh, this is a page from the archives, which I found thanks to Josh, who I think is on this this Zoom in the archives at UW Oshkosh, and it's an example from 1846 of this old British American government being used right away in a new place. So that summer, all of a sudden, there's just a swell of people from elsewhere, from New York, from Vermont, from England, from Ireland, from other parts of Europe, who are coming to this place that is officially organized under the Wisconsin Territory as Winnebago County, and pretty soon has a post office named after Oshkosh the man, and soon will be organized into a city called Oshkosh. But at this point, all there is in terms of US government is Winnebago County, and a family of 6, husband, wife, 4 children, arrive in the summer of 1846, and the husband, who's kind of older and is, I think, a Methodist preacher, is seriously ill. The county government just kicks into gear and does what overseers of the poor farther east would do, which is that they meet, they decide that they are going to take care of this family, and then they guarantee that whoever takes care of them, and in this case, I think it's Joseph Jackson, is going to be reimbursed by the county treasury. That includes a doctor and medicines, and ultimately the county pays $73 for the care of the Hurleys, though they recoup about 49 of those dollars after Andrew Hurley dies and they sell his horse and wagon. But even the remainder of about $14 is equivalent to the entire territory tax that the county paid that year. So it's a significant amount. And I use this example just to show that as soon as they arrive, Americans from the East are using this British-style government under the authority of the territorial government. To go back to this timeline, not that we have to know all of this, but after the really interesting moment in which supporters of Oshkosh, or I've sometimes heard it pronounced Oshkosh, vote for his name to be the name of the post office, and then ultimately becomes the name of the city. The territorial legislature creates Winnebago County very shortly after. This is Oshkosh from around 1845. He's still summering, living in his summers on the shore of Lake Winnebago, pretty close by, I think, when this vote happens. And then Winnebago County adopts this symbol for the county at first, and immediately starts regulating the market, doing something that in England an incorporated borough would do, and in New England a town would do, which is that they charge peddlers or sellers or merchants a $10 license if they want to come into town and do business. At the same time, they take responsibility for poor relief and start governing in this old British American style. in 1853, when they incorporate as a city, they use some of these old English terms. They have a mayor, they have aldermen. From what I've read, early Oshkosh aldermen were incredibly powerful, and did the jobs of a street commissioner, an overseer of the poor, an inspector of elections, and were county supervisors for their wards. So they had a lot of the power in that first organization of Oshkosh. Here's an early map, 1858, showing the division of wards. This house and the Evans property, I believe, I have to do more work on this, but I believe these are exempted from city taxes at first, but pretty quickly are folded in, more or less where Menominee Park is now. And there are pretty full tax records that give us a sense of what people paid for in this period. They divide the tax out in a way that makes it quite transparent, I think, to the payer what each little bit is for. And you can see here that they're divided between state taxes, which again are much smaller than the city and the county taxes. But even within the city and county taxes, there are additional taxes for particular uses, like schools, to pay for a bond for a bridge that they already built and borrowed on, for the indebtedness of the fire department, as you can see here. And these books are really useful. I asked a couple of student researchers, Darren Reimer Jr. and Noah Castine, to look through them for me. And they did, and I want to point out a couple of things that they found. Noah did excellent genealogical research and found where people were from, and so you can kind of see a pattern of where the property owners are from by the 1860s. And both Noah and Darren followed individual lots over the course of time. And you can see here that Edward Eastman, both while he's living and he dies somewhere here, but his estate, you can see that the total amount that he paid really bounces around. And I think I have some comparison numbers here. So let's see. Let's say $100 in 1843 is somewhere between $60,000 and $100,000 in tax purposes in the present day, and so you can get a sense of like how much this is. These are significant amounts in this period, and really changes dramatically. You can also see that all of a sudden his property valuation goes way up in 1867. I have to do more work here, but I'm assuming that something like what just happened in the city of Oshkosh, like this year, with a new valuation of property, happened after the Civil War here in 1867. So here too, I'm kind of at the beginning stages of this research, but I find that it's still true that local taxes are far bigger than state or national taxes in this era. It's still true that they're doing a lot of the governing of the state and the locality and of everything. They're doing a lot of governing. It's still true that people are lobbying to be excluded from the city tax, are concerned about property taxes, and we can get some idea of what the mill rates, or the rate that you pay per $1,000, right, is how that works for you experts out there. Yeah, so the volatility is wild, Mike's right, and I'm curious what else you would want to know about early Oshkosh as I continue to work on this. What jumps out at you? What are you interested to know about? Where do you want to see this research go? Yeah, tied to the present day. I think I need to do that and to see how things change throughout the 20th century, my weak spot. How did they tax industrial sites? That's a great question, and I think one that my students even discovered, and I need to know more about that. Um, Public parks is a really good one. Don't think so. I'm still in the first generation after incorporation, and I can't think of a public park yet founded, but they're going to be in the 19th century. And so I want to find. And so if you have specific questions you want to know, Mike, about what they're doing with public parks, I want to know. For industrial sites, there are different levels of taxation. For farms, there are different levels of taxation, and I think that's how they get around the Evans objection, is that they kind of find a way to tax as a farm for farmland. Yeah, so population numbers are important. So I think I need to add that here. The taxes do track with population fairly well, but also when they make big public investments, that of course leads to a lot of debt and an additional tax. And I think your question is not an obvious one, John. I have found that taxpayers are generally not complaining in the early USA, like say circa 1800, and certainly not complaining about poor relief. And they only start complaining in the middle of the 19th century. It becomes more controversial. So I think you're right that that's a great line of research. Is how does public perception change over time? That's not at all obvious. Oops, let me go back here to this timeline. So Josh points out that personal property taxes are often in the back of real estate. Yes. Yeah, so what are they on, and why did that change? And I think I know when that was abolished in the early 20th century, but I need to know a lot more about why they do personal property taxes. So you're right, Josh knows these books very well. Here's a photo of the very back of the 1860 tax that sums up everything that the whole city is paying. But you're right, Josh, that there's this point in between the real estate taxes and this back cover that does a small number of personal property taxes. I think for people who have significant personal property that is not represented and not much real estate is when that usually happens. But I want to have a more exact answer for that really good question. Yeah, and I think Matt's right. One way that this past can be helpful is understanding what mistakes we made in the past, and that can be tough. I think I need the judgment of public administration people like yourselves, and figure out what lessons we can learn. And the media landscape is really important. The newspapers that I've looked at, especially the Oshkosh True Democrat, one of the earliest ones, are kind of boosters. You know, there's a lot of boosterism in there. They're also not entirely representative. They represent a printer's opinion best. The editor of the True Democrat actually acknowledges that most people in town are Whigs when he starts publishing. And even the state level Democratic Party is not an anti-slavery Democrat like he is, and so he is kind of idiosyncratic. But it does matter. I agree. Yeah, I think you're right, League, about the Wisconsin income tax happens around the same time that personal property tax is abolished. And Brooke asks a great question. I think it speaks to population size. In a much smaller place, you can communicate more to people about what their taxes are paying for. You also pay your taxes in person typically. And so, I'm sure there are a lot of under the breath comments, uncomfortable conversations that happen when the tax is being paid. Um, but what's captured in the sources that I can see suggests that there's not a tax revolt, certainly, and not a lot of anger. But I want to know more. Did it change with the rise of lumber barons? A really good question, and I want to find out more about that. I had a grant, and I started at the beginning of Oshkosh establishment, and got about 20 years, and so I need to go further for that. Lots of really great insights here, and great questions, and I urge you to reach out to me too with other questions or things you would like me to look at. I'll put my email here in the chat, and I want to just emphasize a couple of things. Here's a list of sources that I consulted for this presentation in particular, and things that I'm curious about and that you've answered in good part already. I think I am, and I'm really want to recover the past of local government because it was so powerful. It taxed so heavily, and it did a lot of the work of governing in the early United States, and yet I think is kind of forgotten in large part, underappreciated. What lessons are there in that for local government in the present day? I'm kind of curious for you to help me figure out. I can see where people get frustrated with local government then and now, but it did a great deal. I think you're right, Matt, that when people know who the beneficiary is of the taxes that they're paying, there's something about that that alleviates their concern. They can see right where the money's going, and that helps. And that's one, I think, big lesson. And John asks about elections. In the 19th century, and I think this is true right into the Oshkosh period, most elections are annual, so they're very close to the voters. And the relationship between local governments and the state and national government, something that Gayatri brings up, those are really, really good points, and I want to figure those more out. There's a lot of research in England about the relationship between national and local, and it tends to back up what Mike is saying about the U.S., that reforms often begin at the local level and get to the state and national levels. But any other feedback that you have is really helpful to me, we have about 5 minutes, and I'm happy to chat with people, but I know that you're busy, and so I just want to say thank you all very much for coming and for helping me think through some of the old papers that I found recently.
Oh, thank you, Gabe. That was absolutely fascinating. Are there any more questions people have for the last 5 minutes or so? I mean, that archival stuff is just, I mean, like I said before, I mean, local government has historically, I think just because of the number of local governments and the fact that it's closest to the people, it's been a laboratory for reform.
Yes.
And your work really shows that front and center. That makes it less abstract, which is very interesting and relevant to public admin.
The tricky part, though, and I'm sure that you all have found this, is that there's so many local governments that it's hard to tell a big story. It becomes really complex, and that, I think, is part of the reason that historians tend to ignore it.
I think you are absolutely correct. Well, if there's no more questions, I can say just thank you, everybody, for coming. Our thanks to Dr. Loiacono for his presentation. If you have any further questions, you can always email the Whitburn Center directly at whitburncenter@uwosh.edu. You can email me directly at fordm@uwosh.edu, and certainly Gabe put his email in the chat. You can reach out directly to him. Our next Whitburn Wednesday event is going to be virtual, and it's going to be February 19th at noon. It's titled All Hands on Deck, How Collective Impact Initiatives Can Address Wicked Problems. And we're going to have representatives from nonprofit organizations visiting us to talk a little bit about how they can work collaboratively with one another and with local government to solve some of the most pressing policy issues facing our local communities. So thank you very much to everyone for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a fabulous holiday season.
You too, and thank you all.
Yes.